Thanks for joining us for the second installment of the webinar series entitled Youth Inclusion in Africa. And today the focus of the webinar series is looking at youth inclusion or youth activism in Africa. And we have three presentations today. And this webinar series, or this particular webinar, came about through research that the CSVR has been doing on youth inclusion in Southern and East Africa. And one of the themes that came up in our review of literature, programs and policies is the need for greater youth activism to actually bring about greater youth inclusion. And so that's what created the focus of today's webinar. The first presentation that we have today is from Gugu Nanjinge, and Gugu is from CSVR. I'm just pulling up some details on my side. Apologies, we had just a couple of technical issues that delayed us a bit today. Let's see over here. All right. And Gugu is holds the position of a senior advocacy officer at CSVR. She is an external communications and advocacy professional with extensive experience in the social policy sector. Her areas of interest lie between gender and climate justice. She is also an NDP 2030 ambassador, and her personal work through her foundation is focused on the holistic development of an African girl. Gugu has been recognized by the British High Commission in South Africa as a woman leading on climate change activism ahead of COP28. She has also been awarded the Social Cohesion and Civil Society Main Award by the National Youth Development Agency and recognition as a Masisulu Woman of Fortitude by the Department of Energy for her work on gender injustice. Today, Gugu is presenting work that the advocacy team put together, looking at the shrinking civil space across Africa. And I'd just like to hand over to Gugu.
Okay, cool. Thank you so much, Steven. Afternoon, everybody. I think I'm gonna try share my screen for my presentation today. And then I'll close my video. Please let me know if you can see it, Steven.
Yes, it is up.
Let me do this. Should make sense. Okay, cool. That's fine. So as Steven has sort of mentioned, my name is Gugu Nanjinge. I also work with the CSVR as a senior advocacy officer at the center. I think before I begin my presentation today, Steven, I wanted to us to sort of recognize and note that today is International Democracy Day. And if we are going to be speaking about youth activism in Africa and the continent that has a majority of its population as young people, we're out to recognize this day that is Democracy Day, right? Because it is a day that is sort of formally set to encourage our governments across the continent, or rather across the world, to sort of strengthen democracy. And if we are going to be honest about the conversations that we're going to have going forward on these platforms, we need to also be honest about the state of democracy in our continent and the fact that it is worrying. And especially the case now during this COVID-19 pandemic, where we've sort of seen a decline, or rather a worsening situation when it comes to human rights or even civil liberties in our respective countries. As a matter of fact, if we are going to be talking about activism, we also need to touch base, or rather even speak on how these lockdown measures during this pandemic by security sort of agents and our government have sort of also have some sort of negative effect on human rights of individuals in our respective countries. As a result, like in South Africa, 26 human rights complaints were made in the first day of the lockdown, including one suspect case of murder. In countries like Zimbabwe, we have soldiers who, in Rwanda, we have soldiers who were arrested for raping women. In Uganda and Zimbabwe, we have seen some social media sort of shutdowns, several videos also even circulated online where security forces were sort of beating and torturing people in broad daylight. So if we are going to be talking about civil liberties and the decline of human rights, of how human rights are sort of treated in Africa, we are to pay attention to how COVID-19 pandemic has sort of exacerbated this in our respective continent. So today I'll be speaking mostly, or rather presenting a paper that was written by my late colleague, Selby Klima, who sort of wrote this under, the theme of freedom being under siege in Africa, and sort of exploring the shrinking civic space and violations of freedom of association and assembly in sub-Saharan Africa. It further looks into strategies for sort of countering these restrictions in our respective countries, or even as a region as a whole. I think as I sort of started my presentation, Stephen, one thing that we need to note is that SSA, or rather Sub-Saharan Africa, has sort of recorded an increasing number of national governments that are cracking down on civil liberties, civil society organizations that are set to address human rights and social justice issues, not just this year or the past year, but for the past 2 decades in the continent. And human rights activists, together with journalists, social movement leaders, political activists, and even trade unionists, are among those who have shown, or rather sort of spoken about these gross human rights violations that we sort of see unfolding, especially when it comes to the lack of service delivery in our respective countries, and again, the social justice sort of challenges that we see playing out in our countries. However, again, these social, or rather these civil society organizations and these activists have also been seen holding our national governments and leaders accountable for development and also for good governance, especially living in democratic countries. For us, of those who are living in democratic countries, it is again good to note that their civic participation and activism have also been met with quite a lot of brutal force. And as I made special mention to the current COVID-19 pandemic, we've sort of seen this getting much more worse. We've seen how their civic participation have sort of been met with physical assaults, torture, and to some extent killings and intimidation. And I think in some countries, especially the most recent countries in Nigeria, in Zimbabwe, we've also seen quite a lot of surveillance by intelligence units, and also seen quite a lot of internet shutdowns as well. And this is the way how our national governments have sort of met this civic participation, especially by civil society organizations and journalists as well. I also want us to sort of paint a picture of how these attacks and persecutions against activists working on land and environmental issues has also been on an increase. So it's not just those who are working on social justice issues or other human rights related issues, but also it bottles down or touches base also on those working on land and environmental issues again as well. For example, the case of a woman in Durban who was shot and gunned down in her home by just being an environmental justice activist in South Africa. So these are recent news, and these are recent updates that we're seeing. Another thing is that this crackdown on human rights defenders and civil society, as well as the shrinking sort of civil space that we're experiencing in our respective countries, sort of flies in the face of commitments by many African governments who are set to sort of promote and uphold the rights of freedom of association and assembly in this respect. In our continent, and based on some of the work that they've sort of done over the years. So it's something that sort of contests what we say that our democratic countries sort of stand for, based on what in contrast with what our nations are sort of experiencing. I think another thing that we are to note is that this continued crackdown on civil society organizations that are set on addressing those human rights issues in sub-Saharan Africa not only shrinks the civil space, but also destroys the backbone of inclusive development and democracy in Africa. And if we are going to talk about human rights, we have to talk about the democratic political cultures in our respective countries. Given the lack of political will by our national governments to sort of address and even uphold the rights of freedom of association and assembly, there's sort of a need for both continental and international mechanisms to sort of step up to sort of step up their efforts in upholding these rights in our respective countries. So my presentation today, more than anything, is to provide an overview of the shrinking civil space, as well as the situations on the violations of freedom of human rights, of association and assembly in Africa. It also will highlight innovation and strategic advocacy approaches that are employed by some civil society organizations that tend, or rather work to defend their civic participation space. I think I'm going to move to the next slide. My laptop is just frozen. I think another thing that I want us to sort of touch base on is that on how sort of this shrinking civil space is something that has been seen by a number of data houses. For example, Freedom House it found that in 22 countries in sub-Saharan Africa have seen a decline in freedoms between 2019 and 2020. So if we are going to unpack it, we need to be able to also take some of this data into account going forward as well. So an overview of the shrinking space and freedoms of associations and assembly violations in sub-Saharan Africa. The current operating environment for one, civil society organizations has been deteriorating, and that's something we can all sort of agree on, with governments not just in one country or in one region, but just across the continent, using state machinery, including law enforcement and state security forces, and to some extent, as well as judiciary and legislative arms of government, to one, intimidate social justice and human rights activists, but also organizations as well. We've seen arrests being made, or rather enforced disappearances, torture, threats to closure, and deregistrations of a lot of NGOs in the continent. And government have sort of resorted more than anything to subtle ways of restricting our civil society when it comes to operating through when it comes to officially registering some NGOs, one, because they are deemed as forces that are trying to work against the government. So they've sort of worked to restricting their access, or rather to proper NGO registration processes. And this has been an issue when it comes to civic activism, because it has been met with a lot of shrinking space, civic space, as I mentioned, by our national governments, who have sort of, as again, made sure that they put quite a lot of restrictions and quite a lot of red tape when it comes to when it comes to these registration of these organizations, who sort of silence them when it comes to speaking out and holding these governments accountable, in becoming increasingly, and it's also becoming very increasingly difficult for them to operate in the space and challenge these national governments. Another thing that we've sort of seen is civil society organizations are often accused, as I mentioned, of being foreign agents, and again, branded much more as anti-economic development, and that they pose a threat to national security. One thing that has been seen in the media space is how critical voices are often cast as a threat to national interest. And this has been seen in respective countries such as Zimbabwe, Zambia, Tanzania, Egypt, and again in Nigeria most recently. It has also been reported that in some countries where NGOs sort of receives quite a large sum of funding from Western countries, governments tend to sort of impose quite a lot of restrictions on civil society organizations based on the type of funding that they sort of receive. Another thing that I want to touch base on quickly is the closing down of internet for a couple of days. We've seen it play out in Zimbabwe. While there's a lot of clash between civil society and state security forces, and this happens quite a lot while they carry out quite a lot of human rights violations against citizens. And this happens when social movements, not necessarily work with what the government sort of expects, but also speaking out against civil society and against these human rights violations. The most important thing, again, is noting the role of the African Union in all of this. I'm also just cognizant of time, Stephen, is that the AU has sort of set up quite a lot of continental vision and aspirations for the next 50 years, such as, for example, the Agenda 2063, which was set in 2013. It is presented as Africa's blueprint and master plan, which is also a manifestation of a Pan-African drive for freedom against others, prioritizing peace and, again, a democratic government. As a matter of fact, aspiration 3 in Agenda 2063 sort of envisions an Africa of good governance, democracy, respect for human rights, justice, and a rule of law. It is also good to note that it is a critical enabler of this vision, is that citizens' rights to organize have the liberty to, one, speak out against poverty, inequality, and injustice. It will also be good to note the African Charter on Democracy, Elections, and Government, which is the ACDEG, which sort of guarantees the right to freedom of association. The African Charter on Human Rights and People's Rights, which is also known as African Charter as well, sort of recognizes an African citizens and people's rights to freedom of association in itself, right? And a number of African member states have sort of signed and be part of these number of normative frameworks that work to guarantee and also act as mechanisms that are there to promote and protect the rights of the freedom of association and assembly. There's, again, a sort of a growing number of trends of citizens' fundamental rights to assembly in Africa. I think more than anything, governments in our continent sort of continue to use new and existing laws to limit the creation of legitimate sort of civil society organizations. And I think this is something that that also, in as much as it is a huge role of the African Union to sort of have these normative frameworks, it is up to our states to sort of follow through and make sure that the protection of these civil liberties sort of is successful in these respective countries. The UN as well, I don't think I'm going to go too much into it, is also has played quite a number has set a number of human rights instruments that are set out as provisions on human rights to one, freedom of association and freedom of assembly. And again, there's a number of other mandates that they've set that our countries or other member of states have ensured that they decide, or rather have ensured that they stick to when it comes to the protection of our people's civil liberties and human rights as well. The last one being civil society innovation and also sharing some strategic advocacy approaches to defending rights and civic space. Human rights defenders in Africa, including journalists, social movement leaders, political activists, and trade unions, have sort of, in the main, been the voiceless when it comes to the fight against human rights violation, mainly because they've been silenced by quite a lot of national governments, and they've been met with quite a lot of corruption, social justice challenges, and this is something that is seen through not just in the northern parts of the continent, but it's a very very recent and very stark examples that we've seen played out in Swaziland, Mozambique, Zimbabwe, and Lesotho. And I think in the middle of all the challenges of the shrinking civic space and violations of the rights of one, freedom of association and assembly, civil society, human rights defenders, and the media, I also want to note, including activists, efforts to monitor and publicly expose these human rights abuses have also intensified beyond forming formal movements, but also have used quite a lot of technology, networking platforms, and other ways such as litigation, amongst others, to sort of find strategic ways to defend human rights and the civic space. And some of them obviously include the networks and the partnerships that they form, the use of social media and VPNs. And then this is especially in the case one of the most important weapons when used by civil society for sharing in real time in some countries where gross human rights abuses, including violations of freedom of association by law enforcement and intelligence officers have sort of played. We've seen a number of videos and images being widely shared on social media by citizens and social movements through the social medias and the use of VPNs. The second last one being litigation, and the last one being peaceful demonstrations, sit-ins, and petitions that these civil society organizations have sort of resorted to. In conclusion, the rights to freedom of association and assembly are under siege, and this is something we need to pay recognition to, and this is not something that respective countries need to pay to sort of work on, but also it is a continental problem. Where paranoid governments insist on clinging onto power and consider any dissenting voice to their repressive and authoritarian way of doing things as much more of a challenge. And I think if we are going to talk about democracy and if we are going to talk about progressing democracy in Africa, we sort of need to ensure that we speak about these as well. I think I am going to end there, Stephen. Thank you so much.
Thanks so much, Gugu, and yeah, thanks so much for what I think is also helping to set the stage, and I really appreciate your time, and very much looking forward to the next couple of presentations. The next presentation that we have is by Bwawe Ivan, and Bwawe is from Uganda. He was the 80th Guild President of Makerere University. He holds a degree in law from Makerere University and a post-diploma in legal practice from the Law Development Center. He holds a postgraduate diploma in gender and equality studies from the University of Iceland. He is also an LLM student at Makerere University. Bwawe is a lawyer and is also passionate about public interest litigation. He also contested for the Central Youth Representative in Uganda's National Assembly. Bwawe, over to you.
Thank you so much.
Please let me know if you need any help with sharing the presentation.
I need you to switch on to start my video.
There we go.
Cannot. Yeah. Hopefully I am visible enough.
You're looking good. Thanks.
Thank you. I am dealing with youth activism in the global village. Greetings, everyone. My name is Bwawe Ivan, as earlier introduced. I can say I'm in my transition from being youthful. I am 30 years of age, and I've heard on very many platforms people saying being youthful is a feeling or is an association. I rejected that notion, and I think it has a lot to do with age, but also it's a reminder that people should grow and we should accept growth in one or the other. Looking at the global figures about young people between age 15 to age 24 constitute about 1.1 billion. And this entirely constitutes about 18% of the global population. Having this in mind, we are going to narrow it down to Africa, whereby almost 60% of our population is under the age of 25, making Africa one of the youngest continents. Well, these figures might seem scary, but in my view, this can be a resource, but also a recipe for disaster. Having that in mind is the issues of young people. The population that I have mentioned does not in any way deduce the need for activism. Going on to activism, particularly in Africa, activism is born out of fear, it's born out of love, and in many cases, we find ourselves that activism can also lead to revolutions. It just needs an organized group or an individual to stand out, and then others follow. Activism for the proper causes has capacity to mobilize others to join the struggle in any area. And the beauty of activism is that you can choose, you can customize it, you can tailor it, you can choose the way you do it, you can choose whether to write a blog, you can choose whether to go on the streets, you can choose to do a tweet, or you can choose to engage your community in one way or the other. And as time has gone on, activism has continued to change. It manifests in very many different modes. However, what has not changed is those things, the tiny detail that triggers activism in the young. Therefore, as the African continent, activism, more so from the young people, is required. Already, I want to applaud the very many activists in different areas that have stood out. However, we still need more activists, because the bigger the number, the bigger the voice, and that's the only way we can drive the voice home. Africa has its own challenges. We continue to struggle with poor leadership, bad governance. Of recent, there was a coup d'etat. Even when that is very bad in one or the other, it's not good for democracy. But then also the other underlying issues about constant molestation of our constitutions, national constitutions, to favor a few strong men. Those are issues that we continue to grapple with. And then we extend into the broader spectrum of human rights and all that. At the moment, we have a new issue at hand that we seem not to appreciate, the issue of climate change. So there is quite a lot that we cannot afford to sit back. Peace activists all over, from Ethiopia to name it. But I want to assure you that never has there been any transformation in the world over without full participation of young people and activists. I want to draw us a little back in history. In 1789, those that led the French Revolution were young people. There was anger by the way they were treated. There was also an aspiration for a better France. To date, those events still affect France in one way or the other. Talk about when the Americans in 1776 had to pick up arms against the British over the issues of taxes and overtaxing them without getting a benefit. Recently, the Arab Spring, about 10 years ago, a young man, Saul, put himself on fire. And what happened, everyone knows. Tunisia is changed forever, and the impact on in the Middle East and elsewhere cannot be underestimated. Out of that, our activism becomes critical to human dignity. And none of us does not want to be treated inhumanly. And it's a constant call for us to be active, to sell our ideas. And at times we've been blamed as mainly young people that we do not know what we want. I want to re-echo my other colleagues and say, at least we know what we do not want. We might not know what we want, but we definitely know that we do not want the way things are. And therefore, there is need to disrupt the status quo, one of the core elements of activism. Activism in our African space, with the shrinking space, as the previous presenters noted, is not a bed of roses. It is risky business, actually. We are not short of news in Africa, anywhere, mention it, where activists are killed, they are jailed, they are persecuted. But nevertheless, the movement grows and we have more activists. At the moment, we have unique avenues on exercising our activism. I have had particularly an issue with fellow activists. And I have to say this is that activism must be planned. There must be a plan of tangible outcomes and how we want to achieve it. Otherwise, without planning, it is empty activism. What are some of the interesting things that we have today? Even with a clear understanding that governments all over the world are trying to restrict access to internet, to social media, and all that. But that is an avenue available for us. And we have seen hashtags trending and causing an impact. So, but beyond being keyboard warriors and being on social media, we also need to empower ourselves. Physical meetings are still critical to plan on what we want, to network, to broaden our tactics, to challenge our own notions, but also to hear other views about our activities, but also of our methods. I have a habit that when I bring a plan on the table and it receives no criticism, then I worry about the impact of my actions. Otherwise, we need to listen to those that disagree with our means or with our modes, and then adjust accordingly to achieve the purpose of any given campaign, no matter where in the world. We need to take broad steps, as I've said, and utilize the networks we get. Learn from others' experiences. Most of the things are not new that we do. Others have done them. For example, a struggle for democracy currently is not new. We just have to hear other people's experiences, tailor our actions and our methods to achieve the results we want. But that said, the COVID-19 pandemic has not lessened the need for activism. It has actually given us another challenge amidst the very many challenges we are facing as Africa, to also look into things about vaccine equality, the very many rules by the World Trade Organization over vaccines and other innovations, science innovations. But also we have our own problems that have been laid bare by COVID-19. There is no country in Africa, particularly in Sub-Saharan Africa, where we do not have corruption, COVID fund related corruption. Do we need to sit back? We need, obviously, corruption is not good for ourselves and for our economies. Therefore, we have to continue with the work of pointing out the wrongs and aspiring for better governance in whatsoever it is, but also in the management of COVID-19 relief and associated funds. That said, I want to conclude by saying that we did not invent activism, but we can add value to it. And being focused on our campaigns targets will definitely yield results. We keep on doing whatsoever that is within our means to achieve the different campaigns, but also to encourage others to speak up and to join activism in any way possible. Thank you so much.
Thanks so much, Bawe. Thanks for your presentation. And yeah, thank you so much for adding to the previous presentation as well. Our last presentation is by Aisha Namukwaya, and Aisha is the chairperson of Uganda Muslim Women Vision. She is also a patron of a national youth forum called Women Affairs League that operates in all higher institutions of learning. Aisha has directed all of her efforts towards changing lives through skills development, counseling, radio and TV talk shows in a peace-building campaign for youth. She is also a capacity builder and psychosocial officer at Mwemarere Rehabilitation Center, a lecturer, and is also a lecturer at Kampala University, as well as a gender specialist, mother and wife. Aisha, I just wanted to check, do you still need me to share your presentation?
Yes, please.
Okay, great. Let me quickly get your presentation.
Our listeners, I welcome you. I thank you for
Aisha, I think unfortunately the audio on your side is not great. I'm not sure if we can maybe do something about that.
Am I on? I'm not on.
Okay, it was getting better.
Okay. I welcome you.
Oh.
They go on.
Aisha?
Yes,
I'm not sure if you can come maybe slightly closer to the device that you're connecting with. It was still a bit difficult to hear you.
I don't know, I think I'm audible.
Yes, that is better.
That is better?
Yes.
Okay, thank you so much, Mr. Steven. Dear listeners, the pre-current speakers, I thank you very much for the presentation that you have prepared. From whatever I've heard, it's like Africa, we have the same problems, really. And it's like one country, because whatever Miss Google has said and Mr. Ivan, they are the same things really happening to the youth. My topic is unpacking the potential of youth in national development. Can we go to the slide, Mr. Steven? The next slide. Yes, I was looking at some facts about Uganda. The youth, but Mr. Ivan has talked something about the statistics of the youth in the world and the youth in Uganda. Yes, that slide, thank you so much. So we said many of the youth are in the informal sector. Many of the youth are in the informal sector. And again, a few are employed in the public sector. The others are self-employed. As we've heard from Ms. Ivan, I would like to, after we have heard all that about the youth, the activism, the murders now happening around the world, the coup d'etats are coming back, the youth activism, really being an activist is knowing and devising means of getting it. So the means of getting it, sometimes that's where we find problems. Basically, activism is what you want and aspiring to getting it. So the youth are trying to, but government is being negative. So is technology wrong? What can we do? So we are looking at the how part of it. The youth potentials, we see the youth are energetic, that is very good. The youth are flexible, the youth are adaptive. Mr. Steven, the next slide is where I am about the potentials of the youth. These youth are daring, the youth, they love learning and unlearning. So you find that they're not like old people. When they work today 8 hours, tomorrow they have to sleep and then reorganize the bonds. No, for the youth, every time they are energetic, they are about to go, they are adaptive, they are daring, so inquisitive to learn and to come. Potentials have to translate them into meaningful national development strategies. How can we translate these potentials? So, number one, we are looking at skilling these youth. Yes, skills are, some youth have gone to school. We appreciate at least a reasonable number. But you find that whatever they have got from school is different from what is in the field. So we like these people to learn tailoring. We like them to learn maybe carpentry, plumbing. These are very important avenues, and to diversify. Our dear listeners, and Mr. Steven, you bear with me. Now the teachers, it's now going to 2 years. They're started home early childhood development, the pre-primary schools here in Uganda, the primary teacher, the lower secondary, they are sitting now for the young men and seated. So to give them diversify and you create peace. It's all about creating peace. Secondly, we can look at capacity development. Yes, these youth have gone to school, they have the degrees. Yeah, we appreciate and thank you. But can they write reports? Can they write concept papers? Do they have those skills? So capacity development is very, very important. And it goes hand in hand with soft skills. I saw this Center for the Study of Violence and Reconciliation that has invited us did a study, and they had to mind more about the soft skills. It was very good. Our youth lack decision-making skills. They lack planning. So you find that this capacity development is very, very important in as far as national development is concerned. The other issue is about youth livelihood finance programs. In Uganda, we have the Youth Livelihood Fund, and it came from this livelihood program in 2010, but it has been stopped by 2015. because it was mismanaged by everybody. You can't say the youth because they are given money. Where they where supervisory whatever. So if I apportioning will have to change, not to the youth, but the other issue is curriculum improvement. We find that the degrees that people have studied cannot find them jobs in the field. So it means the government have to see how to change the curriculum to suit the needs of the community and the world at large. Really, our curriculum from primary to university level, you study from primary up to S6 when you don't know what you are studying until when you get to the university, that you can be introduced to psychology, sociology. Now you are a teacher teaching ethics, but that stage is too late to change a youth into meaningful person that can contribute to national development and peace. The other issue is about scholarship assistance. It's also a very good strategy that we can look at. Some of the youth don't complete their studies because they lack money to complete. So as a government, we can even dictate and say now we are giving scholarships to only doctors. We shall give scholarships to students who are doing sociology, maybe. So if we have this scholarship scheme and it is well streamlined, the procedures are very clear, you'll find that we are improving day and day. The other issue is about exchange programs, the internships. The youth need exposure. The youth who has gone to Nairobi, has gone to South Africa, he has moved to UK is very different from a youth who is just seated here in Kampala. The way they look at the world is very different. So this one who has been exposed in exchange programs, even after studies, when you have not moved, you have not interacted with different people, your thinking is myopic. But then when we are to have these internships, the exchange programs, sorry?
Wanji.
Okay, maybe someone is not muting their microphone. And the second last point is building patriotism. Patriotism is very, very important. Having that nationalistic heart, feeling sorry for your country, feeling sorry for seeing things are not moving the way they should, seeing some youth being imprisoned for nothing. You see the government buying more of tear gas than investing in construction, than investing in industry where more youth can get jobs. You really wonder and know the situation where we are in Africa's youth. Investing more in bringing tear gas to fight this youth is not creating peace, it's just creating havoc. Okay, so we need to see that we train our youth, we train our children from primary schools up to the university, these nationalistic tendencies, loving your country, doing everything, knowing that I'm here, I'm not going anywhere. And that tendency of thinking that money is not in our own countries, it is by going outside. I happen to have worked with the Ministry of Gender under the Export Labor Department. But I saw how our very energetic people, very useful people are just being exported to the rest of the world, which is not bad. If it was in good spirit and if they are not going to be underemployed, that is very good because we have talked about exchange of programs. So people should go and get exposed, yes, but the way they go, the companies under which they go, the conditions of work, they have no ethics, okay? So you find that our youth is still in problems and we shall not have peace until we look into this mindset of our youth, thinking that they can get money from outside their own countries. Let's try to put programs, let's try to put strategies that can embrace our youth and they love their country. And lastly, involving in leadership. we thank God that this time around in Uganda, at least we have had a very reasonable number of youth being involved in politics, and they have gotten leadership, because the saying goes that being in possession is being in position. So if you are in position, you are in possession of resources you can direct, you can pass acts, you can declare any other thing. So we would like the youth to participate in leadership so that we can have meaningful development after unpacking these potentials that they have. So I think, and I hope, and I call upon everybody, if the youth are unpacked by these potentials they have, we think we shall have a meaningful national development. I thank you very much. Back to you, Mr. Steven.
Thanks so much, Aisha. And yeah, great. Thank you so much for your presentation, which also really builds on the points that were raised by Gugu and Bawe. I just wanted to ask the attendees that are with us, if you do have any questions or comments, please add those to the Q&A section. But if you would like to also raise your hand, if you would like to speak and contribute to the conversation, please also just raise your hand and we will be able to unmute you. We do have one question that has been asked, and this question is from Dominique Dixpeak, and Dominique has addressed the question to Bwawe. Bwawe, Dominique is asking or saying this is such an interesting discussion. In South Africa and other parts of the continent, we often seem to see two contrasting situations. One is where we have youth who are active or activists and work to make change in their community and country. And two is youth who are apathetic and hopeless to make change. How do you suggest we work with the second group to ensure more participation and give them hope that that change can happen? Bawe, what do you think about that question?
Thank you so much. I want to clearly state that that's actually the reality in most of African countries, if not all. I am also a very strong advocate of a saying that says we should not only be youthful, we must be useful. Let us. I think this entirely rests in policy, and it has to be deliberate and targeted by government, as Aisha said. The state of hopelessness is a contribution by very many other factors beyond the control of the young people. I also do not want what I am saying to mean that there are no youth that have been available opportunities and they've squandered them. But very few can access those opportunities. But also those ones that are hopeful, our side of it, we are in the exception and we are within the minority. And because we enjoy a particular privilege that not every other young person enjoys, that's why we should be actively more involved to make sure that our governments, our leadership structures address the structural issues that are keeping young people hopeless. Why should you, the privileged, and me get more concerned? It's because when they are in that state of destitution and all that, at the end of the day, they are going to come and shoot you when you're entering your gate. They are going to come and rob you in broad daylight. They are going to hit you because you have a mobile phone, you hold an Apple. They are going to steal your monthly pay. I think we need to engage much more. Most of those with authority to make these policies and to look at the broader perspective of a society. A good society takes care of its people. A bad one only favors a few, which is very dangerous and it's not sustainable. Thank you.
Thanks, Bawe. Thanks for that contribution, and thanks, Dominique, for the question. If there are any other questions or comments, please feel free to add those to the Q&A section. And yeah, so raise your hand if you'd like to contribute. I think for me, obviously, one of the things that I've been interested in that came up in Gugu's presentation and that Bawe has also touched on is, the very different situations that young people face in terms of activism across the continent. And I think, like Aisha mentioned, when we engage with people from different contexts, we actually really get to get a sense of what it is really like in different contexts. And for example, in South Africa, we might have certain challenges with activism, but we still have certain freedoms, we still have certain rights, and I think there is still the use of state violence in response to protests. But I think in other contexts we've seen instances of young people being tortured, young people being executed, or a great number of missing person cases that we've seen. And that might be a question that I'd like to bring up for everyone is, how do we deal with the great differences that we see across the continent? How do we move youth inclusion? How do we move young people's rights forward together, across the continent? What are some of the things that you might have seen? What are some of the spaces that might already exist where we can further youth activism in Africa? It'd be great to see if our panelists or if any of our attendees have any thoughts on that.
Hi, Steve. I'm gonna take this one. I'm gonna jump. I'm not sure if you can see. Sorry for everyone for jumping in and out. I want to take this one, Steve. We have research or other public perception data that sort of points out how sort of youth participation on the continent seems to be declining to an extent that some of it is even touted as youth apathy or amongst young people when it comes to voting and participating in democratic elections. The activism part of it, what formal democratic structures or other formal institutions are not noting is how our young people, not just in South Africa, but Africa as a whole, have sort of resorted to these informal movements or rather forming of these movements because of the lack of inclusion in this formal decision-making structures or in these democratic structures. So I think if we are going to be talking about, if we are going to be, locating this discussion in this International Day of Democracy Day, we also need to speak quite a lot about youth activism and how young people they resort to youth to forming of these activist movements, or rather making sure that their voices are heard because they are not being involved formally. And hence they mobilize themselves outside of the normal, formal structures of one governance or rather other institutions in society. So I think that's something that I wanted to sort of stress the most, is that youth activism is not because young people are genuinely just not interested in participating in formal structures, but because they're actively being excluded and not consulted and invited to the decision-making tables.
Thanks so much for that, Cooper. Yeah, and I do think that is a great point, and I see Aisha would also like to add. Aisha?
Yes, I would like to add on what Ms. Gugu has just said. Even when they are included in these formal institutions, they are rendered irrelevant. Like they get the youth, They give him a car, they give him money, and he's just there enjoying. And any other policy that is concerning the youth, he does not raise hand. He's alone. It's not democratic enough to pass a decision. So sometimes they're included on those committees, but they are rendered irrelevant. Yes, thank you.
Thanks, Aisha.
If I may jump in, is that one thing about human nature is that if today we are striving to achieve a particular thing and we achieve it, nature dictates that we shall demand for more. So what I'm trying to put forward is one, that activism is an ever-evolving and an active process that does not end. It's kind of a chain. One bit links into the other. But also when I relate to what Miss Google has said and Miss Aisha, it goes back to the actual intention of that inclusion. And also to ask ourselves a question, is it meaningful? And we have had this discussion about the issues of gender and tokenism. Usually, I am not a fan of tokenism. And what is happening all over Africa is that we want to count, our policymakers want to count statistics and who is on the table, not what one, the one on the table brings, and also the freedom actually to air out ideas and the way they are received at that very table. Because you and me will accept that discrimination and exclusion, as Google said, happens in different stratas. But if we do not break that thinking, that when you are at the table, you're represented, then we are not going to solve the problem. And young people will rebel, will revolt, and where they think that it is overly pressing and there is not any other option, sadly, violence will remain the only option. And when violence remains the option, then the other parties that seek to preserve their positions unchallenged, for whatsoever reasons they have, will also use violence in return. And therefore we shall be in the cycle of war and conflict. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Bawe. Thanks for that contribution. And I'm very much looking forward to being able to watch this webinar again and just hear the valuable points that are being made here. And I'm also watching for hands and for questions if anyone else would like to add to the conversation. I see that Gugu did add some points in the chat here. And Gugu said a key underpinning of social movement theory is that marginalized groups are often left to fend for themselves when they are failed and overlooked by the structures that ought to represent them. Perhaps this lens is one that can help inform our understanding of youth participation in a way that is reflective of the growing concerns and tensions amongst youth in countries like Nigeria, Zimbabwe, Kenya, Uganda, and South Africa, to name a few, where youth voices made headlines for mobilizing outside the status quo in recent years. And a couple of points maybe that I'd like to add to the conversation is, I mean, in speaking to young activists, there's just concern about young leaders being absorbed into formal structures as a way of breaking down social movements. And young activists that I spoke to in South Africa referred to some of the leaders from the Fees Must Fall, or the Fallist movements in South Africa's universities, saying that many of those leaders were absorbed into the ANC and are now members of parliament, and questioning that, saying, is that a good thing or is that a bad thing? And, you know, obviously I'd like to hear others' thoughts on that. But another question for me is, I guess, as this conversation started, as we were talking about the coup that's happened recently, is I guess when we mobilize outside of formal structures, is that not used by governments as a justification for the use of violence. You know, when young people are mobilizing outside of democratic spaces, when they are not participating through elections, then government somehow says, no, you know, this is the reason why we are being violent. And I'm happy to see that Andrew Songa would like to contribute. Andrew, I have unmuted you.
Hello, thank you, Stephen. I'm not sure whether I can be heard.
You can, thank you.
Yes, I just wanted to pick up on a small thread or something you've raised with regards to social movements. And while I do agree with some of the themes that have been picked up in terms of social movements being a response to exclusion from the so-called formal structures, and how that then can attract backlash from states, shouldn't we also be looking at it from the other lens, where we do have some levels of constitutional evolution on the continent that have actually recognized social movements and civic action as one of the formal principal ways of public participation or engagement in governance, so that we don't just look at it as a peripheral response or an extra legal response to engage in public affairs, but rather it's a formalized, constitutionally protected response or form of engagement within what is constitutionally recognized as public participation. So how can we then talk about strengthening the input that can come from social movements, from activism, from civic action, and maybe just to refer to a very recent example in Kenya, where we were having a debate around what it would take to review or amend Kenya's constitution. And one of the things that emerged from a high court decision and a court of appeal decision recently is that there has to be a threshold of measuring what public participation and what a public initiative to amend the constitution would look like. And thresholds were set up, such as civic education, a constituent assembly, creating dissemination of information so that everybody is fully informed, and then a referendum. But I think a thread that was important within that decision for this conversation is the very clear distinction where they recognized that the sovereignty of the people then puts within them, at least within the constitution making process, a constituent making power that can be expressed by themselves and away from state agencies and away from state organs, and that is also formally recognized as a channel of engagement in public affairs. So I think in a long way, I was just trying to raise the fact that we should talk about social movements, we should talk about civic action, not only being protected by the Constitution, not only being protected by international treaties and our African Charter on Human and People's Rights, but also being a very formal, recognized channel of the public's engagement with governance affairs.
Thanks so much for that, Andrew, and that's a great point. And I don't want to say too much. I'm watching for hands, and obviously, it'd be great if we can get some responses from other panelists to your contribution. And maybe before we do that, if anyone would like to add to what Andrew said, is I think Bawe has said there's no justification for the use of violence against its citizens. The failure to organize free and fair elections has eroded this trust, hence the mobilization out of the formal structures. And I guess that point that these formal structures have failed, and lead to the need for these informal avenues is a good point, and something that researchers also picked up on. And Bawe also mentioned there can be a fear for a time being, but when the fear washes away, then the cycle of violence continues. And I think for me, Andrew's point has got me thinking about, how do governments see social movements? How do they see protests? And the example that comes to mind for me in South Africa is the Obviously the Students' Fees Must Fall movement in South Africa, as well as the gender-based violence movement, which I think led to Cyril Ramaphosa creating an emergency response to GBV, allocating, I think it was 1.6 billion rand to addressing the issue of, or the scourge of gender-based violence. But now I'm left wondering, where are we with that? I know people always say that change takes time, but I guess for me, maybe it's difficult to know where that movement is right now. I see Bwawe would like to contribute, and feel free to go for it.
Yes, please.
There has been a question, is that how do governments see movements, social movements? And let me try to answer in my space as a person who has led demonstration and strikes over fees. So when I was still the leader of Mackay University, we rejected completely any increase of tuition and demanded that government funds public institutions, increases funding for public institutions, of which we interested them, and they did increase funding to all public universities in the country. But to the government, we are trouble causers first. And when we are defined as trouble causers, then the next step is to crush us, the trouble causers. And you can imagine every demonstration was met with bullets, armored vehicles, arrests, and all that kind of stuff. But then persistency and clarity about the campaign and the struggle later turned, and they would start seeing us in terms of numbers as we were almost headed to an election. So because the mobilization was countrywide, it was not a student affair, it was a countrywide affair, then they decided to manage the numbers. Because I remember the actual engagements began when we wanted to take over parliament. And we tried, we were in a distance of about a half a kilometer to parliament when we were met with heavy force that you would see. So, unfortunately, our leaders in Africa and governments wait to deal with the symptoms, and usually they never deal with the actual problems. And the absorption of these young leaders and the privileges that follow is, it is tactical that the only way you can disband a movement is by picking its leaders, co-opt them, and then what happens next, the one I've seen all over Africa usually, then those that were being led, instead of choosing new leadership, instead start attacking those that were leading them before and were later co-opted by the state. So that is how this works. However, and this is what I talked about, that we need to be sharing ideas. How do you maneuver? How do you tilt the balance? How do you move from a leader that has been co-opted and is speaking a different language to a leader that continues the struggle as if the other one never appeared? So we need to share ideas. We need to also create a mechanism that formal structures do not necessarily determine the power and the direction of any social movement organized. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Bwawe. I see we've got two more contributions, Aisha, and then we'll go to Andrew.
Yes, please. Thank you, our dear listeners. And for me, Mr. Steven and our listeners, I do not very much advocate for violence as a form of expressing our grievances, our dissatisfaction, really. when we go for riots, our children die. I'm a mother and I'm a victim where my brother was shot from those Makerere demonstrations, and whatever we are doing, I'm a student of Makerere also, a graduate at 2002. So we also had a demonstration because of the killings of some girls at different gates of Makerere. But then when we demonstrate, I don't see very, very positive. They just come for firefighting. They give some small resolutions, but then it doesn't send really a very big message for change of policy. I've not seen policies changing from use of violence. We would rather look for strategies, very innovative and creative and modern way of dealing with issues, minus resorting to violence. I know our governments, most of them, that's the language they hear. But most cases, most of the time, they come and firefight. But then the policies don't change much. Their school fees structures don't change much. When people's lives have been lost, so really we are peace building, we are reconciling, we are trying to see how we can advocate for this activism, we can advocate for our rights minus using violent means. I would like us to look along those lines, please. Yes, thank you.
Thanks, Aisha. Andrew, would you still like to contribute?
No, sorry, that was from before.
Okay, no problem. Yeah, I see on my side that the questions seem to have come to an end. And maybe in closing, obviously, you're welcome to raise your hand and still ask any questions. But I'd just like to thank everyone for joining us today and for what I felt was a very rich discussion that we've just had. I think as Bawe is saying and linked to what Aisha was saying, I guess there is a lot of debate around the use of violence in protests and who is actually violent. Is it the state's response to protests that is violent? Are protests in themselves violent? And I guess there's a lot of different views on that. And as CSVR, I guess we also suggest that the state and many states can respond. The go-to response is to use violence and not negotiation or discussion. As Aisha also mentioned, there's no meaningful engagement with young people or with protesters, and violence is legitimized by the state and kind of owned by the states. But yeah, I see there are no other hands raised. And again, I'd just like to thank everyone for joining us today. And I hope that you've enjoyed this conversation. And please join us next week, Wednesday, the 22nd of September, for the final installments of this webinar series, where we'll be looking at national and youth development, really discussing what strategies have been used and what strategies should potentially be put forward to bring about greater youth inclusion. From myself, I just want to say thanks to everyone and thank you to the panelists for their presentations as well.